Hello and welcome to another video. My name is Lizzie. It is nearly the end of the year. It's December. We're counting down now for the new year, and I thought I would share with you some of the best non-fiction books that I have read this year. I love a good non-fiction book. I will admit I don't read as much as I want to because often they're intimidating, but I do enjoy reading non-fiction. I read some really good non-fiction books this year. So I have 5 books in my top 5, plus a bonus honorary mention to a poetry collection, because I felt like it fitted better here than with my fiction books top 10, which will be coming on New Year's Eve. So without further ado, let's get in no particular order to my top 5 non-fiction books with bonus poetry of this year. The first one I'd like to talk about is Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Perez. A lot of people have talked about this book. It's a very popular book, I think. It's a very kind of more mainstream non-fiction book that is generally widely discussed, which is probably the case for quite a lot of books on this list, to be honest. And as soon as I heard about it coming out a couple of years ago, I was like, I need to get on this. This sounds like my sort of book, and it was. This book basically exposes the way that the world is built for men, specifically white cisgender heterosexual men, but in the context of this book concentrating on the gender divide and sometimes touching on other divides as well. It's the sort of book where it made me so mad at so many points, because all these things that we've never even thought about, because it's just the way that things are built. It's built with a specific body in mind, exposing a lot of the medical discrepancies between how much is known about the male body versus the female body, the way that all kinds of governance and like economical practice is approached with the male gender role in mind, but also making the case for why that should change. Not just, I mean, obviously, 50% of the population is a pretty good case to be made, but also showing how it would benefit everyone if more people are considered during the manufacture of products, or during medical research, or during drawing up of governance guidelines and things. This book is amazing. As you can see from the amount of tabs I've put in, there were so many points that I was like, yes, I need to remember this, I need to come back to it. So highly recommend. It's very readable as well, which is always good in a non-fiction book, that you can just sit down and just read it. I should also say you will see a bit of a theme across most of the books in this video. I do read quite a range of non-fiction, but I think all of the most impactful non-fiction for me that I've read this year has been about the world we live in right now and our society we live in right now, and that is reflected in some of the other books on this list as well. So with that being said, the next one on my list is The Transgender Issue by Shawn Fay. This book is just incredible. It's quite short and is basically, I think it describes itself as a manifesto for equality and for liberation for trans people. Our society is built and set up for cis people, and Shawn Fay exposes that and also goes into detail as to why that is, and how we can fix it, why we should fix it, why it benefits not just the trans community but everyone, and how trans people are at the forefront of liberation and freedom, and that if we as a society can embrace that, we will all be better off, while also tackling the real day-to-day issues of trans people, such as homelessness and healthcare access and things such as that. I did see one review that described it as every sentence is a mic drop moment, and it really is. Like, you're just reading it and it's like bam, 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 bam. So much information, but in such a digestible way, in such a readable way, and everything presented just so clearly with, I don't want to say no room for argument, because that kind of implies that you must take everything at face value and believe it. That's not the case. It's a case of basically destroying any argument that you could make against anything that Sean Fay has a case for, including TERFs and transphobia, etc., etc., all of those things. Then she's like, let me tell you why you're wrong. And she does it so well. Such a good book. It was amazing. It was amazing. Now let's have a little shout out to some poetry. I haven't really read much poetry this year. I do enjoy reading poetry and I want to read more poetry, but it's not something I sort of pick up out of habit. I have to kind of, encourage myself to do so. So definitely on the 2022 reading goal, I think, to read more poetry. But I read an amazing poetry collection this year called When No One Is Watching by Linathi Makanda. Lots of people compared this to sort of Rupi Kaur style of things, and I can see that it's a very similar way of writing. I think if you enjoy Rupi Kaur, you will really enjoy this poetry collection as well, in terms of the structure and the way that sort of so few words are used to create such an emotive experience. But what really blew me away about this poetry collection was the narrative across the whole collection. It's sort of structured on the different periods of someone's life and their relationships, and examines all those different periods across the collection. And it was just such a moving piece of writing. It was amazing. And I think you did get that sense of narrative and that sense of completion and fulfillment when you got to the end, which I don't think I've ever had in a poetry collection before in that same way. I read this in January and I haven't stopped thinking about it since. It was incredible, and I highly, 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 highly recommend going to read it. Back to non-fiction sort of prose, and the next one a bit different from the other ones on the list, and that is Snow by Marcus Sedgwick. Now, I love Marcus Sedgwick's fiction. Some of my all-time favourite books are by Marcus Sedgwick. And when I found out he had this non-fiction book and there was an abridged audiobook on BBC Sounds, I was like, yes. His fiction often is set in very snowy places, often things like Russia or in the Arctic Circle or in sort of Scandinavia and Siberia, places like that. And although his fiction often has a fantastical element to it, it is very rooted in the real lives of people who live in these sort of extreme weather conditions most of the year. This is basically a collection of essays of his own musings on snow. So there is musings on the scientific aspect of snow, on the linguistic ways that we talk about snow in different languages and cultures, on the visual aesthetics of snow, how it's been used in art, how it's influenced music, how it affects our day-to-day lives, how it's used in sport. It was just such a lovely way of having all these different varied topics that all focus on one everyday mundane thing that is also, it's an everyday mundane thing, but it's also a really magical thing, We always get excited when it's the first snow of the year, if we have snow that year. And it was just a really lovely listen as well. So if you do get the chance to listen to the audiobook on BBC Sounds, it was a really nice listen to that one. So yes, I really, really enjoyed that one. Next up, another one I read at the start of the year, Sounds and Sweet Airs by Anna Beer. This book is a collection of sort of mini biographies about a selection of female classical composers. I myself am a classical musician, and I've, always tried to sort of elevate that music that has been lost due to an incredibly patriarchal structure of classical music. And I've always enjoyed sort of discovering that, so it was really nice to read this and to learn about some women I had heard of and some I hadn't. And what I really enjoyed about this book is it was so focused on their achievements and not necessarily on where they were held back. Of course, it did touch on that, especially with regards to some of the women they talked about, such as Clara Schumann. But rather than focus on the barriers in their way, it was about why and how they were able to achieve what they did. We all know why, women would have struggled to make it in that field, because the amount of money and support and things like publishers, and you need orchestras and conductors and performers, and there's just so much that is so difficult to do if you're not a typical, by which I mean white male, composer. So by focusing on how these women were able to achieve what they did, it really shone a light on how just a few people can make a difference. If you've got a female benefactor, for example, who supports other women, not just because they're other women, but because she likes their music and she was in a financial position to help them, or having supportive parents who were able to fight for places in music college and things like that. So this was a really, again, very insightful and fascinating read, and because of the structure of it, of being kind of mini biographies, was quite a nice one to read like alongside other fiction books, because you could just dip into it, read one chapter, and then that was that person, you'd read that person's chapter, and then a few days later, or a few weeks later even, go back to the next chapter. I read very little non-fiction about music, which is probably because I did 5 years at university reading non-fiction about music. But it is something I want to read more on. You can't really see it, it's not on my background here, but I have a whole shelf of unread non-fiction about music, of like academic books. So maybe this year, who are we kidding, it won't be this year, but maybe this year will be the year that I read them. The last book on this list is a very recent read for me, and that is The Hidden Case of Ewanforbes by Zoe Playdon. This is another book about transgender rights in the UK and trans liberation in the UK, and this one has a more historical focus, so it has two sort of simultaneous sort of threads going through it. One being a history of our public understanding and perception of the trans community in the UK and how that has influenced the legal and medical assistance available to people. And then on the other side, you had the story of Ewanforbes, who was a baronet, a Scottish baronet, who I think died in the 90s, who was born in the early 20th century, who was assigned female at birth, medically transitioned as a young man, and had to fight a legal battle to inherit his title, which could only be inherited by men. This book was so comprehensive, but also very clear in laying out all of the different things at play here, and I've personally found it really eye-opening as to my own opinions and experiences. This book really helps to, I think, show me how some of my preconceived notions, some of which I still didn't realise I was holding on to, how they've been formed by the media when it comes to the trans community, and I really sort of appreciated this book for that, but also giving a wider history of trans rights in the UK for the last century. And if you read this book, I guarantee it is not what you would expect. Nothing is as we are encouraged to think it is when it comes to the history of trans rights and trans liberation in the UK. So those are my top 5 non-fiction books I read in 2021, with some bonus poetry thrown in there. I am going to set myself a challenge next year to read at least one non-fiction book every single month. I have plenty to get me started and keep me going to do this challenge for about 3 years. But if you have any non-fiction books that you would recommend me, then do let me know. Have a lovely day, and I will see you next time. Bye!